As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, there are a lot of people still up in Healdsburg at the parish retreat. The annual parish retreat happens in October. Some people were there who have come back. I left this morning at 6:20. It's awesome. And the parish retreat has a lot of traditions, a lot of things that we do every year. And there's a fairly new tradition which has to do with a beloved, now departed member of the congregation, Lynn Park. Lynn died 3 years ago, something like that. Yeah. And she was an artist. She was primarily a photographer, but she had a bunch of journals that she kept. And when she died, she left a bunch of journals. And they're actually pretty, high-quality artist journals. They're like 100% rag paper and all of that. And so a member of the congregation, Lisa Taggart, collected them, and she has them up at the Bishop's Ranch at Healdsburg. And she invited everyone to take one of these journals and to draw in it or write in it, and she had a basket of colored pencils. And so I found myself sitting at the Bishop's Ranch. If you've ever been there, it's a bunch of buildings in a beautiful wine country setting. And there's a chapel in the very center of the campus. And I found myself sitting with one of these journals with just a random bunch of pencils that I grabbed, drawing the chapel. And I noticed that thing that happens when you draw or paint something, which is that if you don't pay attention for long enough before you start, you end up unable to actually draw what's in front of you. I mean, I've been painting and drawing my whole life. I'm kind of an artist. I've been doing it since I was 9. And nowadays, I practice the art of iconography, and it's a slightly different kind of an art form. But there still is this connection between the art of iconography, and you see icons all around you, and the kind of contemporary understanding of painting. I have a good visual intelligence. Even though I've got a little red-green color blindness like a lot of guys, I can perceive color well. I understand the canon of design well. I've studied it. I can even, form an aesthetic opinion of a view. But seeing and painting are two very different things. And I think that the principle that underlies this phenomenon has to do with the way that people nowadays are taught to paint. The first thing is that you're taught to paint what you really see in front of you, not what you know is there, not what you believe is there. And second, you're taught not to paint literally. You're taught not to paint everything that's right in front of you. So when I was a child and I had a box of crayons and a pad of paper, I would make a picture of a tree. And maybe you have this experience too. It would be like a green ball on a brown stick. Because that's what I knew about trees. They were green up here and kind of like that shape, and down below they were kind of like this, and wood was brown for some reason. I don't know why. That's what I knew about trees. But what I had to learn is that if you really look at a tree, really, really closely look at one, you see that the color is complex and the lines that make sense of the color are also complex. It isn't really green. It's gray and yellow and brown and green, and its shape is not simple. It's jiggly lines and patches of lightness and darkness that make what look like leaves and bunches of leaves and bark and trunk and tree. But if you try to capture each of those individual elements in a painting, if you try to paint every individual leaf and every piece of bark, it's too much detail. Even if you were able to capture every detail, it would just be too much for the viewer to take in. So the fact that I can see, the fact that I have a certain faculty with visual aesthetics does not necessarily mean that I can paint the way I want to. I cannot always see the image in front of me and edit out the parts of the image to make a painting. I don't always have the ability to connect what I see with my eye to what my hand is doing with a brush on a canvas or a board. So if there's any hope for painting, it has to do with leaving behind preconceived ideas of the way things are supposed to look and really looking at the scene with open eyes. And that is very difficult. I have to move beyond what I know and edit out what doesn't matter for the painting to make sense. So what I'm learning is that in order to see, I really have to want to see. A blind man named Bartimaeus is sitting by the side of the road, doing what it is that he can to beg a living from his sighted neighbors. And the surprise in the story is that when he learns that Jesus is passing by, he sees something that nobody else in the scene can see. This is the very first time, the first of 3 times in Mark's gospel, that anyone identifies Jesus as Son of David. And that really isn't just a way of getting his attention. Calling Jesus Son of David is a political statement. Even in the subjugation by the Roman Empire, the Judeans remember David, who's kind of like the archetypical monarch, who's the national center of freedom and unity to all the people. But unlike some other political rulers, the blind man sees that Jesus is the Son of David who brings mercy. Mercy is the quality that defines him as God's chosen one. And even though he's blind, Bartimaeus sees that Jesus is the one that bears God's mercy for all of the people. It is mercy that heals them and makes them whole. So Bartimaeus sees something that nobody else can see, and he cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus sees him and stops what he's doing and calls Bartimaeus to his side. Then he asks the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" And for me, that's the question that opens up a new vision of what mercy is like. Because that question is kind of a duh question. "Hello, blind man. What would you like me to do for you?" "Oh, I don't know. Would you redecorate my living room?" No. Obviously, to me at least, the answer is he wants to be given his sight. But Jesus doesn't just hear Bartimaeus calling him Son of David, Merciful One, and force him to see. Because Jesus dignifies Bartimaeus by asking him to name his desire, which tells me that mercy looks more like a relationship than a fiat power. Mercy is about relationship more than it is about unilateral action. Mercy takes seriously the desire of the other person, and it never assumes to know what the other person wants. So how would you respond to Jesus' question? What is it that you want? But before you answer the question, recognize that it requires you to look at your need as well as your desire. Each one of us is needy in the face of God's mercy. And God doesn't just magically fix things in this life. God doesn't force a way into our lives in order to make us see. Very much like my painting teacher, God asks us to really look at what's happening around us. God asks us to look and see what is in front of us and not just what we expect to see. God's invitation is to pay attention to the life that we really want not just what we see on the surface. Now, of course, the wonder in the story is that Jesus gives Bartimaeus what he asks for. Or is it? Maybe the wonder is not that Jesus gives Bartimaeus what he asks for. Maybe the wonder is that Bartimaeus can see the promise of God before he receives it. Jesus gives Bartimaeus his heart's desire because it's also the desire of God. In that moment, in that single moment, is the place where Bartimaeus and God's desire come together. So Bartimaeus understands something about God. And again, it is that God is always merciful. And Bartimaeus understands something about himself, that he is always in need before God. There's a little bit of a surprise which is buried in Bartimaeus' name. It's like a little Easter egg in a video game, which they don't call video games anymore. The name Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus, right? That's what the gospel said. But it also means son of poverty, which I think is important, not just because Bartimaeus lives on the fringe of society. It's important because it places Bartimaeus in a relationship to God. He has a need that he cannot meet himself. He is poor, and God is rich in mercy. And maybe not surprisingly, that's the part that catches me up short. Because I notice I have trouble accepting that I too am poor in relationship to God. And more than that, I have to admit my poverty in order to receive God's mercy. Which tells me that naming our neediness opens a way to wholeness and to a new vision. I think that all of this, I'm learning something about the spiritual life, which is that it's very much like a painter's life. First, you have to really, really learn to see, looking at the world with open eyes and open heart, studying your life for the sake of seeing yourself as you truly are. And second, you have to express yourself and your desire on the basis of your need. But you have to place that need and that desire in the context of what you really see in the world. So maybe for faith to grow in our lives, we've got to move beyond the obvious, because we can't get stuck in what we already know. We have to look at what is really happening. And I think that when you start to see things as they really are, and not as you know them to be as they've always been before, I think that's the place to be open to God's mercy. And I guess the last thing to say is that God's mercy is always present. I think God's mercy is always forgiving.